Billionaire's wife fights for life while he throws Mistress a lavish bash. Hey, beautiful souls, welcome back to Alcott Stories, the home of untold love, deep emotions and powerful truths. Today, I bring you a story that will stir your heart and shake your soul. What would you do if a billionaire threw the most lavish party for his mistress while his wife lay in a hospital, fighting for her life? It's a story of betrayal, survival, and the breathtaking rise of a woman who chose herself over everything. Trust me, you don't want to miss this one. I'm pouring my heart into these stories to bring you the best of the best, family. All I ask is for one small support in return. If you haven't yet joined our sweet Alcott Stories family, please hit that subscribe button right now. Your support means the world to me, and it helps these powerful stories reach even more hearts. Now grab a tissue, and let's dive into this unforgettable journey. Sarah lay beneath the sterile hospital lights, her once radiant skin now dulled by pain, yet her inner strength shimmered beneath, the surface like a flicker of sunlight under stormy water. Tubes fed life into her failing body, but nothing could feed the emptiness growing inside her. Every beep of the monitor echoed like a countdown, not just of her life, but of the love that had once held it together. Her fingers twitched weakly as she tried to adjust the wedding ring that no longer felt. Like a promise but a prison, the nurses whispered kindly, but even their voices couldn't drown the silence that wrapped around her like a shroud. Photos of her once happy life sat on the nightstand, moments frozen in time, with a man who no longer looked at her the way he once did. Robert Kingston, her husband, her protector. The man who had once vowed to be hers in sickness and in health was nowhere near. The headlines said he was restructuring his empire, but Sarah knew better. She had seen the party photos, him in a midnight blue tuxedo, grinning beside a blonde bombshell in a glittering dress that cost more than the hospital wing she now lived in. Emily. Her name tasted like betrayal. The woman who had once been introduced as a friend of a friend had now become Robert's favorite arm candy. His distraction, his escape. The media fawned over them, calling them the new power couple, while Sarah coughed blood behind closed curtains. The doctors did their best, but medicine couldn't treat heartbreak. The hospital staff, though kind, walked on eggshells around her, aware of her wealth but unsure how to treat a woman who was rich in money but bankrupt in love. Each time she closed her eyes, she remembered the early days when Robert used to hold her through every storm, when he called her his miracle. Now he didn't even call. Her phone remained dry and silent, except for the occasional empty message from his assistant. Mr. Kingston is traveling. Mr. Kingston is attending a summit. But Sarah knew those trips led straight into Emily's arms. The betrayal was not loud, it was surgical. Clean, wrapped in excuses and ignored truths. She remembered the first time she met Emily, how her gut twisted, how Robert dismissed it as jealousy, how he insisted she needed friends, not suspicions. She believed him. She always believed him, because she loved him blindly. And now she lay here, blinking away tears she refused to let fall. She didn't want pity. She wanted her dignity. But it was hard to hold on to it when even her own reflection seemed to turn away. Her once voluptuous hair had thinned from the treatments. Her eyes carried bags of insomnia. Her lips had forgotten how to smile. But still, in the pit of that pain there was fire. Sarah was no stranger to hardship. She had clawed her way out of poverty to become a respected philanthropist, the woman behind Robert's inspirational journey. Yet here she was, left behind like yesterday's news, while he toasted champagne with a woman who'd never seen him struggle. The injustice burned, but she stayed quiet. Let them think she was weak. Let them laugh at her silence. Inside, she was rebuilding. Inside, she was watching. Inside, she was gathering every broken shard of herself like weapons. The world adored Robert. He had charm, looks, influence. But what good were headlines when your heart had no anchor? Sarah had been that anchor. She had built his name alongside him, and now he threw her away like a fading memory. She watched the televised event from her hospital bed, the audio muted, but the visuals louder than words. Robert kissed Emily's hand like it was sacred. He looked at her like she was his future, and Sarah realized he had made his choice. But so would she. That night, she asked the nurse to bring her a mirror. For the first time in months, she looked at herself, not with pity, but with purpose. Her skin was pale, but her eyes burned. She wasn't done yet. This wasn't the end of her story. It was the prologue to her rise. She would not let the world remember her as the forgotten wife. She would fight not just for her health, but for her voice, her worth, her story. The woman in the shadows was no longer hiding. She was preparing, because love may abandon you, but dignity, when you fight for it, becomes a crown. Sarah sat beneath the dim glow of the hospital lamp, her fingers trailing softly along the rim of a porcelain teacup. Lost in the silence that felt heavier than any noise, memories rushed in like a tide she couldn't stop, flooding her chest with ache and longing. She had once been the girl who raced between college lectures and diner shifts, her textbooks stained with coffee and ambition. And that's where Robert saw her first, head buried in economics, lip bitten in concentration, fire in her eyes despite exhaustion clinging to her shoulders. He'd walked in wearing confidence like a second skin, ordered black coffee he didn't touch just to watch her. Their first conversation wasn't about love, it was about struggle, and how she embraced it with grace. He had been fascinated, obsessed even, with the way she never asked for help, never craved the spotlight. When he introduced her to his mother, a woman carved from ice and wrapped in pearls, the disdain was immediate. She doesn't belong in our world. She had hissed behind expensive champagne flutes, but Robert, back then, was a man who defied everyone for love. He married Sarah in a small ceremony beneath oak trees. Not a diamond in sight, just a whispered promise and trembling hands. They built everything together, every deal, every pitch, every late-night panic attack soothed by her calming voice. She believed in him when no one else did. She edited his speeches. She caught his lies before they became disasters. She stood at his side when investors laughed him out of the room. And when success finally arrived, it came like a tsunami. Cars, estates, invitations, a lifestyle so golden it almost blinded her. But wealth had teeth. It didn't just buy luxuries. It bred entitlement. Slowly, Robert began to crave applause more than affection. Meetings stretched longer. Dinners turned into silences. And Sarah, once his fire, became his footnote. Then came Emily, with her polished laugh and practiced fragility, playing the damsel card while Sarah fought to keep a crumbling marriage intact. She arrived like a storm wrapped in silk, smiling too much, leaning too close, calling Sarah inspiring with just enough venom to make it sting. At first, Sarah brushed it off. She trusted Robert. She had to. But Emily's presence grew, her laughter bouncing off the marble walls, her perfume lingering longer than appropriate. What once felt like a sanctuary became a stage, and Sarah was cast as the ghost haunting the edges. Robert changed too. His gaze shifted, colder, distracted, as if the woman who had once been his entire world now spoke a language he'd forgotten. His mother, long silent, now smiled at Emily with approval she never gave. Sarah, whispers floated through charity events and society dinners. Robert's moved on. She's just the wife in name. And all the while Sarah was shrinking, not because she lacked strength, but because the man she built everything with was tearing it all down, behind diamond curtains. She remembered walking past the grand staircase one night and hearing them laugh together, Emily and Robert, like teenagers on vacation. That laughter broke her more than the silence ever did. The mansion echoed differently now, colder, grander, emptier. Staff who once called her ma'am now looked away. Security details shifted focus. Even the dogs, once curled beside her feet, were now walked by Emily. The betrayal wasn't a blow, it was 1,000. Cuts disguised as smiles. Unspoken exclusions. Doors closed gently in her face. Even the family photos were slowly replaced. Vacation frames where Sarah once stood, now swapped for newer, shinier memories. But Sarah remembered everything. She remembered holding Robert's hand before investor meetings, kissing his forehead before surgeries, soothing his panic attacks before keynote speeches. She remembered loving him through failure, And now she was being erased like an afterthought. She stared at the hospital ceiling and wondered when exactly she stopped being a wife and started being an inconvenience. Her name was still on the will, her photos still in the archives, but in their glittering world, she had already been buried. The beep of the machines reminded her she was still alive, though her heart often felt otherwise. Yet even in that pain, Sarah felt something beginning to shift. Not anger, not yet, but a stirring in her bones. A call to reclaim the parts of herself she had given away too freely. She wasn't just a page in Robert's past. She was the ink that wrote the whole damn story. And soon the world would remember. The hospital TV flickered, its volume muted, but the headlines screamed loud, enough to crack her ribs. Robert Kingston throws $1 million bash for new love. Sarah stared at the footage in slow horror as camera drones circled a glass-ceilinged ballroom aglow with chandeliers, flashing lights and faces drunk on luxury. There he was, her husband, the man she once prayed beside, spinning Emily on a dance floor beneath the same stars. They used to lie under on their lake house roof, whispering dreams into each other's skin. Emily's dress shimmered like betrayal itself, hand-stitched gold sequins, hugging a body that had never carried the weight of building a kingdom from scratch. Reporters called them America's next power couple, forgetting that Sarah had been the one who once fed Robert's soup when he was too sick to walk, had folded his wrinkled dreams into real deals. Her hand trembled as she reached to turn off the TV, but her heart refused to look away. Her face, now thin and pale from months of fighting for breath, reflected back at her in the black screen once the image cut, so different from the woman who once walked into boardrooms and commanded silence. And yet somewhere deep beneath the devastation, something stirred. It wasn't just pain, it was insult, humiliation, a cold slap of reality. They had all erased her. Not just Robert, but the world, the media, his family, even the party guests, once her friends, clinked glasses with Emily like Sarah had never existed. The betrayal reached beyond marriage. It was the public rewriting of her legacy in real time. She could almost hear the laughter that echoed through that glittering ballroom, the orchestra's music drowning out her silent agony. The champagne fountain sparkled in slow motion in her mind, a mocking contrast to the IV drip beside her. She imagined Robert raising a toast, smiling as he kissed Emily's cheek, while the only thing Sarah tasted was the bitter tang of medication and metal. Her breath caught not from sickness, but from the ache of realizing she'd been replaced, not just in love but in story. Yet as the pain threatened to pull her under, something inside her refused to drown. Her soul did not break, it boiled. Lying there, wires tangled like shackles, she realized she had one thing left they couldn't steal, her will. She began to see things clearly, not just the lies, but the pattern. She had been quiet for too long, polite for too long, forgiving to a fault. They had mistaken her softness for weakness, her silence for surrender. But in the quietest room, a woman can hear her own heartbeat louder than a crowd. And Sarah's heart, though bruised, still beat with purpose. She would not be remembered as the wife who got sick and was forgotten. She would not fade into history as a footnote beneath Emily's spotlight. If she lived, and she would rebuild from the ashes they left her in. Not to win him back, not to punish, but to remind the world of who she was before love, before marriage, before illness. She was not just Robert's wife. She was Sarah Monroe Kingston, the woman who once walked barefoot into billionaire circles and made them listen. Her story wasn't over, it had just been hijacked. And now she was taking the pen back. The next time her name trended, it wouldn't be attached to pity, it would be power. She didn't know yet how or when or where, but the fire had started. And no party, no diamonds, no designer gowns, no glamorous lies could silence what she was becoming. Beneath the hospital sheets, her fingers curled, not in fear, but in quiet defiance. The phoenix doesn't rise because the world is kind. It rises because it burns. The phoenix doesn't rise because the world is kind. It rises because it burns. And from those silent embers, Sarah emerged. Months had passed, each day clawed back from the edge of darkness, each breath a rebellion against the narrative written without her consent. The day she walked out of that hospital, the sun seemed brighter not out of mercy, but because it was witnessing a resurrection. Her steps were slow, but her spine was straight. Chin lifted not in arrogance, but in reclaiming a crown. She had never truly surrendered. The world thought she would disappear into obscurity, but Sarah had other plans, ones that simmered beneath, hospital sheets and sleepless nights. Dressed in a tailored coat and dark sunglasses, she stepped into a law office as if entering a battlefield, carrying not vengeance, but undeniable purpose. Her attorney, a sharp-eyed woman who'd once admired Sarah's speeches, nodded with quiet reverence as Sarah handed over documents. Proof of the shares she still legally owned, buried beneath a maze of forged signatures and whispered betrayals. They thought she wouldn't notice. They thought she wouldn't fight. But they forgot she had built empires before she ever wore a diamond ring. With calculated calm, Sarah began reclaiming what was hers, not through scandal, but through strategy. She didn't scream. She moved in silence, the kind that rattles foundations more than noise ever could. One by one, she reactivated old contacts, resurrected dormant projects, and began to make quiet waves in industries that Robert believed he controlled alone. Her reappearance began as a murmur, a flicker on social media, a curious sighting at a charity brunch where she wore red, the color of war. Paparazzi caught glimpses, and whispers turned into headlines. Sarah Kingston reappears, stronger than ever?
Wife or warrior?
The photos didn't show a broken woman. They showed steel wrapped in silk, elegance that didn't ask for attention, but demanded it. Robert noticed. So did Emily. Their perfect PR. Romance trembled the moment. Sarah's name returned to conversations that had once buried her. Then came the gala, silver chandeliers, couture gowns, the city's elite buzzing about Emily's expected engagement. The lights were blinding, the champagne endless, and in the middle of it all stood Robert, smiling like a man who thought he'd won the game. Until a soft ripple cut through the velvet air, a courier, gloved and silent, approached Robert with a manila envelope marked in gold. He opened it casually, thinking it was another deal, another compliment. But inside was the clean, elegant sting of truth, divorce papers, signed and sealed by Sarah Monroe Kingston. The air changed. Conversations faltered. Emily's hand froze mid-toast. Robert's face drained of color as the documents unfolded, neatly typed, legally flawless and utterly final. No drama, no warning, just an exclamation mark at the end of Sarah's silence. The photographers caught the moment, his stunned expression, Emily's trembling smile, the way the room suddenly remembered Sarah's name. Somewhere in the distance, a jazz band kept playing, oblivious to the fact that the Queen had just made her move. Sarah didn't need to attend. Her absence screamed louder than any entrance. She was done being the woman in the shadows. She was the architect of her own justice, and while the world debated her motives, she walked barefoot across her garden that night under the same stars that once bore witness to her heartbreak. She whispered to herself, not out of sorrow but gratitude, for surviving, for knowing her worth, for walking out of fire without ashes in her mouth. The headlines the next morning didn't call her ex-wife. They called her unstoppable, and she smiled. Not because they finally saw it, but because she always had. The morning after the gala, as headlines screamed Sarah's name and her silent strike echoed across every screen, Robert sat alone in his glass-walled office, the skyline behind him offering no comfort. His phone, once a steady stream of congratulatory calls and investor praises, had turned cold, buzzing instead with boardroom anxieties, public relations warnings, and clipped texts from his legal team. The empire he'd curated so carefully, with glossy magazine covers and curated social media posts, began to crumble not with fire, but with silence. The silence of powerful people withdrawing, the silence of clients rethinking loyalty, the silence that follows betrayal uncovered. Sarah's name, once omitted from every conversation, now rose like a national anthem of resilience. News outlets aired montages of her life, from student to philanthropist to forgotten wife, and now, To woman reborn. Talk shows dissected her strength. Influencers applauded her dignity. And survivors of illness clung to her story like a lifeline. Sarah, meanwhile, didn't bask in the attention. She redirected it. With grace sharpened by grief, she announced the launch of the Phoenix Foundation, a safe haven for women battling life-threatening conditions, a platform where pain was turned into purpose. Her first televised appearance was simple. No designer gown, no dramatic speech, just Sarah seated in a white blouse, eyes fierce, voice calm, saying, "I wasn't just fighting for my life. I was fighting to not be erased." Donations flooded in. Women wrote letters. Survivors sent photos of themselves holding up signs. "I am Sarah." It was a movement, not a comeback. Meanwhile, in Robert's world, nothing felt solid. Emily, once glowing with the thrill of being the chosen one, now shifted uncomfortably under the weight of unwanted questions. Journalists no longer saw her as the new flame. They saw her as the woman who benefited from someone else's pain. She smiled for the cameras, but in private, she began to notice Robert's charm was dimming. He snapped more often. He drank more. He stopped sleeping. For the first time, she saw not the billionaire, but the boy who needed constant validation. Rumors circulated that 2 major investors had pulled out, citing ethical misalignment. And behind those closed mansion doors, Emily asked the question that hung like smoke. What happens to us now? Robert didn't answer, because he didn't know. He tried interviews, staged charity events, and half-hearted apologies, but the public had shifted. The sympathy vote had crossed over to Sarah, and the court of public opinion had delivered its verdict. He failed the one person who had never failed him. Sarah, on the other hand, wasn't trying to win anything. She was building, healing, transforming. Her foundation partnered with hospitals. Her story made it into textbooks. She met with women in wheelchairs, held hands with mothers fighting for time, stood at podiums not to be seen, but to give voice. At one conference, a young girl with a feeding tube whispered, "You made me feel brave." And Sarah wept, not out of sorrow, but because finally her pain had purpose. Her name no longer trailed Robert's. It stood on its own, powerful and luminous. Across the city, billboards shifted. Not fashion ads or gala shots, but images of Sarah, smiling gently beside survivors, arms open, eyes bright. Her presence was no longer a whisper. It was a roar. And Robert, now the man who once had everything, began to feel what Sarah had endured. Emptiness, doubt, the hollow echo of being forgotten. But where he had crumbled, Sarah had risen, not to prove him wrong, but to prove herself right. The world watched as Sarah's star rose higher than even Robert's money could touch. But what no one expected was his reappearance, not as a mogul, not as a headline, but as a man stripped of his armor. He arrived without an entourage. No flashing cars or tailored distractions, just Robert, thinner than before, eyes hollowed from sleepless nights. His once flawless appearance weighed down by invisible regret. For weeks he'd watched her from afar, on screens, in papers, in the dreams that left him breathless. He had rehearsed his words in mirrors, but now, face to face with the woman he'd buried in neglect, he found himself speechless. Sarah stood tall beneath the marble columns of a women's empowerment gala, a place he never thought he'd see her shine without him. The air tensed as security stepped forward, but Sarah lifted a hand, stilling them. She wanted to hear it. Cameras clicked, phones recorded, and then he dropped to his knees, not with performance, but with the quiet desperation of a man, finally understanding the value of what he'd lost. "I was a coward," he said, voice cracking in front of 100 silent onlookers. "I was scared of your strength because I couldn't match it. I didn't know how to love someone so whole." His words trembled in the air, not enough to erase history, but raw enough to wound. "I don't want your money," he whispered. "I don't want your name. I just want you." The crowd leaned in, hearts suspended between hope and heartbreak. Sarah looked at him, not the man he was, but the boy he still clung to inside. There was a time when she would have fallen apart at the sight of him kneeling. A time she would have begged for this moment. But that woman no longer existed. The Sarah who stood before him now had walked through fire and stitched her soul back together with gold thread. Her silence said more than his apology ever could. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply inhaled the truth. "I forgive you," she said finally, her voice soft but unshakable. "But I've learned to love myself more than I ever loved the idea of us." A gasp rippled through the crowd, not because she rejected him, but because she did it with grace, not vengeance. She reached down, not to take his hand, but to close the chapter with dignity. "Stand up, Robert," she said gently. "You don't need to kneel. Just learn." She turned, her heels clicking like punctuation marks on a sentence long overdue. Flashbulbs lit up the path she walked. But it wasn't the cameras that captured her glow. It was the way she carried freedom in her spine, peace in her footsteps. Robert remained on his knees, not for show, but because his body couldn't carry the weight of realization fast enough. Emily was already gone, the spotlight having dimmed, and now the one person who'd truly seen him had walked away, not to punish, but to protect herself. That was the difference. Sarah didn't leave out of anger. She left because she finally saw herself clearly. The applause that followed wasn't for the scene, it was for the strength, for the choice, for the quiet revolution of a woman who didn't need revenge to feel powerful. She didn't look back, because queens don't return to thrones they've outgrown. She had become something more than a wife, more than a victim, more than a survivor. She had become a symbol. And Robert, once the architect of her pain, now stood as a monument to the consequences of underestimating the woman who once believed in him, more than he believed in himself. The world wouldn't forget this moment, not because of the drama, but because of the choice to walk away whole. In the months that followed, Sarah's name no longer echoed as the wife left behind, but as a voice leading millions forward. Her face, once hidden behind hospital curtains and tabloid speculation, now graced the covers of books, magazines, and global campaigns, not for scandal but for strength. She had become more than a survivor. She was a movement. Her memoir, The Fire Within Me, soared to the top of bestsellers, not because it was dramatic, but because it was honest, raw, unapologetic, and fiercely human. Women stood in line for hours just to hear her speak, not because she promised fairy tales, but because she told the truth, that healing wasn't linear, that strength could be soft, and that self-love wasn't selfish, it was sacred. Her foundation expanded across countries, forming support networks for women who had been silenced by pain or shame. From cancer survivors to broken-hearted mothers, from refugees to CEOs burned out by betrayal, they all found home in the haven she built. And through it all, Sarah remained grounded, not untouched by her past, but transformed by it. In the final scene of her public journey that year, she stood barefoot in a garden planted by the very women she once wept. Beside, roses named after resilience, lilies blooming beside benches etched, with names of those who had passed but never faded. Her white dress danced gently with the breeze, the sunlight brushing her skin like a blessing, not a spotlight. Laughter surrounded her, genuine and unfiltered, rising from children who had never known fear because their mothers had learned how to fight. Her eyes shimmered, not with sorrow but pride, the kind that anchors you deeper than any romance ever could. As she walked between the flower beds, hands reached for hers, not to take, but to hold, to thank, to honor. A woman in a wheelchair whispered, "Because of you, I asked for help." Another, holding a baby girl, said, "You made me believe I could be a mother and still be whole." And with each word, Sarah felt something sacred settle in her chest. A peace she never found in mansions, in parties, in diamonds, or even apologies. The press had once asked her if she regretted walking away. She smiled and said, "I didn't walk away. I walked back to myself." She hadn't chased revenge. She hadn't sought closure in someone else's guilt. She had created her own. And as for Robert, he faded quietly into the background, a man who once had everything but failed to cherish the only thing that could have saved him. Emily vanished from the public eye, her fame as fleeting as the flashbulbs that once adored her. But Sarah remained, not as a myth, not as a symbol, but as proof that women don't have to shatter to rise, that choosing yourself isn't a tragedy, it's the beginning of everything. She stood beneath a blooming archway, closed her eyes, and breathed in the scent of wildflowers and freedom. In that moment, surrounded by lives she helped reclaim, she knew she had rewritten her story. Not for headlines, not for closure, but for legacy. She didn't win him back, she won herself. And in the soft, radiant silence of that garden, that victory bloomed eternal.